Hello everyone. I hope you all are doing good. Well, after a very long time, I'm here to voice over an article which I recently read and I found it really interesting. It is written by a Pakistani author and her name is Nida Kirmani. She is a faculty member in Lahore University of Management Sciences, Humanities and Social Sciences. So I just wanted to do a voice over this article, so that's why uh, I'm here. Let me just first of all tell you the topic of the article is South Asia. It's not the topic, sorry. Uh, the topic is Can Fun Be Feminist? Question mark Gender, Space and Mobility in Lyari, Karachi, and it is South Asia Journal of South Asian Studies. And how to cite this article is Nida Kirmani 2020 Can Fun Be Feminist? Question mark Gender, Space and Mobility in Lyari, Karachi, South Asia Journal of South Asian Studies. So let me begin with the article. It's a little bit long. I would say it's a little bit long, so if you are having not much time, so you're free to skip it now and listen it when you are having ample amount of time. That's how I would say. So let me read it. Can fun be feminist? Gender, space and mobility in Lyari, Karachi. Nida Kirmani, Department of Sociology, Lahore University of Management Sciences, Lahore, Pakistan. Abstract is the densely populated multi-ethnic area of Lyari in Karachi is one of the city's original settlements. The area has become infamous as the site of an ongoing conflict between criminal gangs, political parties and law enforcement agencies for over a decade. And for this reason, Lyari has been labeled as one of several no-go areas in the city. However, for the residents of Lyari, the ways in which they understand their part of the city far exceed these facile labels. While at times their neighborhoods do become fearful spaces, there are also places of comfort, familiarity and fun. This article explores the multiple ways in which women and girls experience and understand this area in particular. It documents the various ways in which they express and experience enjoyment in their everyday lives and during exceptional moments. Based on extensive interviews and participant observation in several neighborhoods, the research shifts attention away from solely using violence as a lens to understand urban space and away from seeing women mainly as victims of violence, focusing on the pursuit of fun and enjoyment as an area of academic inquiry can be an important way to show how women push against and challenge patriarchal boundaries by highlighting women's and girls' own creative navigations and engagements with their locality and the city. This paper brings new insights into discussions of gender and urban marginalization more generally. Background: the densely populated, multi-ethnic and largely working class area of Lyari in Karachi is one of the city's original settlements. This area has become infamous as the site of an ongoing conflict between criminal gangs, political parties and law enforcement agencies for over a decade, and for this reason Lyari has been labeled as one of several no-go areas in the city. However, for the residents of Lyari, the ways in which they understand their part of the city far exceed these facile labels. While their neighborhoods do become fearful spaces at times, they are also places of comfort, familiarity and fun, aspects which are often overlooked in research on marginalized urban spaces, particularly in Global South. This paper explores the multiple ways in which women and girls experience and understand their part of the city, and in particular whether or how they experience fun. I argue that focusing on the pursuit of fun and enjoyment can be an important way in which women push against and challenge patriarchal boundaries, even if these acts may not always fall squarely into the category of what is generally thought of as political resistance within academic discourse. Based on extensive interviews and participant observation in several neighborhoods, the research shifts attention away from solely using violence as a lens to understand urban space, an approach that has so far dominated studies of Karachi in general and Lyari in particular, and away from seeing women mainly as victims of violence, rather by focusing on the multiplicity of meanings space holds for women and girls, and by highlighting their own creative navigations and using uses of these spaces, this paper brings new insights into discussions of gender, urban space, and experiences of marginality. Lyari, a fearful space located in Karachi's South District and within a population estimated at between 1 and 1.5 million. Lyari is one of the oldest, most densely populated and diverse areas of Karachi, referred to by outsiders as the Columbia of Karachi because of its perceived control by drug mafias. Lyari has increasingly become known as one of the most violent and crime-ridden parts of the city, and is often painted as no-go area by the media and law enforcement agencies. This has led to a sense of territorial stigmatization amongst Lyari's residents, who in response refer to their area as Karachi Ki Maan, the mother of Karachi, marking their place as one of the city's original settlements and also highlighting a sense of comfort associated with their area. Lyari's negative image stems partially from the fact that it has been home to a variety of criminal groups who have become increasingly powerful over the past decades. While like any impoverished urban area, crime has always existed in Lyari. The 1980s is cited as the period in which violence in Karachi as a whole increased as a result of the influx of weapons and drugs during the Afghan war. Drug use spread rapidly in Lyari during this period as knife battles turned into gun battles between rival groups. During the 1990s, crime and politics became very closely intertwined in Karachi, with Lyari's gangs being supported informally by the Pakistan People's Party (PPP). The area has witnessed intermittent bouts of violence for the past 2 decades as a result of conflicts between criminal gangs, political parties, and law enforcement agencies. While public acts of violence most often targeted men, there were reports in some neighborhoods of gang leaders forcing young women to marry them. For this reason, young women's mobility was often restricted to their own neighborhood, where members of their own gang could protect them. Furthermore, many young women reported dropping out or suspending their studies because of a generalized sense of insecurity during the period of conflict. When I began my field work in 2012, Karachi was emerging from a period of heightened conflict between the two major political parties in the city, the PPP and the Muttahida Qawmi Movement (MQM), with a great deal of violence targeted against young Baloch men from Lyari who were suspected by the MQM of being affiliated with the PPP-backed gangs. The following year, the main arena for the conflict shifted to within Lyari, because there was another split between rival factions of the gangs which lasted for more than a year. Hence, during my first 5 years in Lyari, I worked mostly on residents' experiences of various kinds of violence in the area, including everyday experiences of violence, representations of violence, or resistance to violence. At the same time, one of my main purposes in conducting research in this stigmatized part of the city, which is perhaps a shared goal amongst all ethnographers, has been to complicate the way in which people understand Lyari and to move away from only looking at it through the limited and simplifying lens of violence. However, after every presentation I have given on my research, people have often responded by asking, "How do you go there?" or remarking, "Wow, you are so brave." Despite my best efforts, through my focus on violence, I was reinforcing the very ideas that I had intended to problematize with my work. All of those other aspects of the area I am studying, the energy, excitement, warmth, and vibrancy that draws me there, remained silenced in my research. Perhaps this is a limitation in my own methodology or writing, but it is also a limitation in terms of how researchers, particularly those studying poor urban women in the global south, are often compelled to only ask particular questions and frame their research within certain limited categories. If one is writing about violence, how does one also write about all of those moments when violence is not taking place? And if one is researching gender-based oppression, then how does one include all of those moments when women are neither being oppressed nor necessarily actively resisting power structures? Turning one's attention to women's experiences of fun and enjoyment helps to complicate reductive understandings of urban life, particularly in stigmatized urban spaces such as Lyari. The significance of fun. Sociology as a discipline has historically tended to focus on the negative aspects of cities as a result of industrialization including overpopulation, housing crisis, poverty and conflict. While the study of cities in the global north has diversified to some extent, studies of cities in the global south are often trapped in the framework of perpetual, almost apocalyptic crisis. This is particularly true for certain cities such as Karachi, which has come to be understood almost solely through the lens of violence. While this is tied to the fact that Karachi has experienced a relatively higher level of violence compared to other cities in the region, and while this research has shed enormous light on the dynamics of the conflicts that have taken place in this city over the past decades, the almost exclusive focus on violence has also led to a pathologizing of the city as only being defined by violence, with political or ethnic violence receiving the most attention. While one cannot deny the existence of violence in the city, and overemphasis on violence excludes other key aspects of urban life, it also does not help explain the wider context in which various forms of violence exist. Apart from complicating the discussion of third world cities and of Karachi in particular, in the context of literature on third world women and Muslim women specifically, the narrative in general has been dominated by the image of an oppressed Muslim woman shrouded in a burqa. Studies of Muslim women, particularly those from less privileged classes, tend to approach women as victims of violence desperately in need of rescue. This discourse is present in studies produced about Muslim majority contexts in the global north, but is also reproduced in the Pakistani context. Hence, as an upper class researcher who is read as Pakistani, I am framed as being both brave and altruistic for venturing into this most dangerous part of the city to help those poor women. A focus on the more enjoyable aspects of women's lives in Lyari disturbs this very narrow, simplistic, orientalist image which objectifies women as passive victims of violent and backward cultures and of men. Though I have also focused more on the darker side of urban life in my own research, this does not mean fun and enjoyment were completely absent. Rather, these aspects of everyday life were always present in the narratives I heard from women in Lyari, and in my own subjective experience of the place. In my research on women's employment and domestic violence, for example, some women mentioned not necessarily enjoying their actual paid work, which was often underpaid and under awarding, but they did enjoy being outside the home and getting a little breathing space from their own restrictive families. For example, one of the young women I spoke to, Saima, who was in her early 20s and worked at a large department store in one of the malls in the upscale area of Clifton, made a point of showing me a series of selfies she had taken in the break room wearing bright red lipstick to match the t-shirt that was part of her uniform. While we spoke about the harassment she experienced on the way to work and from disapproving neighbors and extended family, there were aspects of her narrative that exceeded the framing of my question, which included the fact that she actually enjoyed many things about her job and the freedom it afforded her both materially and physically. Hence, the aspect of fun or enjoyment was always there, lingering in the background, peeking out from behind the violence and oppression, but it was obscured by my limiting lens, a lens colored no doubt by my own positionality as a middle-class feminist academic. Apart from the importance of talking about fun, just because it exists and because it complicates our understandings of cities and of women's lives, one of the questions this paper explores is whether the pursuit of fun and enjoyment can be thought of as a political act, and whether in particular it can be categorized as feminist. One of the earliest serious studies of fun was published in 1938 by the Dutch historian and cultural theorist Johan Huizinga, in which he studied the role of play in the generation of culture. By contrast, members of the Frankfurt School critically explored the relationship between capitalism and leisure or enjoyment. Following similar lines, Sara Ahmed has critiqued the compulsion towards happiness, particularly in the global north, as one that is driven by capitalism, consumerism, and individualism. She argues that in such a context, being a feminist killjoy and refusing to buy into the compulsion to be happy is a necessary form of political resistance. Where North American and European feminist theorists have discussed the political potential of enjoyment, they have largely focused more narrowly on the experience of sexual pleasure as opposed to pleasure in general. This paper takes a broad approach to pleasure and includes any act through which women individually or collectively experiences enjoyment. I am inspired in this endeavor by the work of scholars of the global south who approach enjoyment as an important site of politics and resistance. I draw on the work of Laleh Khalili on Palestinian women refugees in Beirut, in which she argues that critiques such as Ahmed's against pleasure and happiness are geographically and temporarily specific. In the case of Palestinian women in Beirut and also in the case of women in Lyari, the pursuit of enjoyment is an important opportunity for collective conviviality in an otherwise challenging and often atomizing context, and hence should be read as a political act. In the South Asian context, Shilpa Bhadke, Samira Khan and Shilpa Ranade have written about the importance of loitering, hanging out with no purpose as an act of resistance by women in order to claim public space. In particular, they talk about the political importance of women occupying public space in a non-productive and non-consumptive manner and in a manner that involves women taking risks. Their reference is Bayard's description of fun, which is an array of ad hoc, non-routine and joyful conducts ranging from playing games, joking, dancing and social drinking to involvement in playful art, music, sex and sport, and to particular ways of speaking, laughing, appearing or carrying oneself, where individuals break free temporarily from the disciplined constraints of daily life, normative obligations and organized power. Fun is a metaphor for the expression of individuality, spontaneity and lightness, in which joy is the central element. While joy is neither an equivalent nor a definition of fun, it remains a key component of it. Fun often points to usually impoverished, spontaneous, free-form, changeable and thus unpredictable expressions and practices. Bhadke, Khan and Ranade subsume fun under the broader umbrella of pleasure and argue that pleasure undermines the very possibility of order and control in a society in which ideas of propriety are often centered on controlling women's movements. Hence, women having fun, especially in public spaces, are often viewed as threatening because they challenge the notion that women's presence in public is only acceptable when they have a purpose. In the following section, I focus on a selection of episodes of fun and enjoyment that I observed while spending time with young women from mixed ethnic backgrounds belonging to what could loosely be described as the lower middle class in Lyari, in order to explore further the potential that fun holds in terms of challenging gender norms. This paper approaches fun and enjoyment through James Scott's notion of infrapolitics, which refers to a small everyday actions of refusal and resistance, and argues that these small acts can also have wide-ranging effects on the organization of power relations. However, this does not mean falling prey to the allure of the romance of resistance, while the pursuit of enjoyment can both purposefully and inadvertently push the boundaries of dominant gender regimes and hence be classified as feminist resistance. This is not always the case. Building on a small but growing literature on the political significance of happiness and enjoyment amongst women from marginalized groups, I argue that the pursuit of fun and enjoyment are important means through which women and girls both confront and conform to prevailing gender norms. An analysis of these episodes highlights the multiple meanings enjoyments can hold for women and disturbs simplifying boundaries of resistance and submission, violence and peace, to reflect the complex negotiations that characterize the rich texture of everyday life in marginalized and conflict-affected urban localities. It is through these types of everyday negotiations that gender orders are both reinforced and challenged. episodes of enjoyment. As a researcher who has been attuned to looking for violence, it took me some time to adjust my focus in order to be able to see the enjoyment taking place around me. This problem was made worse by the fact that those who I encountered were also not used to being asked about that aspect of their lives, but rather expected that I wanted to hear about the problems they were facing. As Proud Foot points out, the experience of enjoyment often cannot be captured through the technique of interviewing because these experiences exist in the extra discursive realm. For example, 19-year-old Hina, who assisted me with this research, said that women in her neighborhood hardly have any fun in their lives. She complained about their lack of freedom, the restrictions they face from their families, and the constant judgment of neighbors, issues that young women face across the city. However, when I spent time with Hina in her neighborhoods, the picture I saw was quite different from the one she described to me. Yes, women were not as visible in public space, and yes, they were constrained by various social restrictions, but once we entered the narrow gullies, there were lots of women and girls loitering in front of their houses, chatting and smoking hookahs. They would also go up to the rooftops to escape the heat of their cramped living quarters during the frequent power cuts that plagued most areas of the city, including Lyari. This gave women a much needed break from their household responsibilities and a chance to congregate and catch up on the neighborhood gossip. Perhaps Hina did not identify these everyday activities as being explicitly fun because they were so mundane, or perhaps these activities were not considered fun because they were still constrained in particular ways, occurring within or close to home and in between other responsibilities. But certainly there was enjoyment interwoven within the fabric of everyday life. Apart from these everyday moments of conviviality, women would use the opportunity provided by the religious festivals and rituals to get out of the house and enjoy themselves, something common across the subcontinent and also observed by Phadke, Khan and Ranade in their work on women living in slums in Mumbai. A visit to a shrine, for example, would provide women with a legitimate reason to take a trip out of the neighborhood or the city and enjoy the outing. Furthermore, much like Carnival in Rio de Janeiro, the month of Ramadan allowed a relaxation of social norms which women seemed to enjoy the most. While neighborhoods were virtual ghost towns during the day, the streets were transformed after sunset by a party-like atmosphere, particularly as the Eid holiday approached, a phenomena that is common in most non-elite Muslim neighborhoods across the region. For women in Lyari, Ramadan provided a legitimate excuse to go out with their friends and female family members in the neighborhood, often under the pretense of shopping, but more often just to wander around almost as flaneurs, enjoying the sights and sounds of the street. Very often the pursuit of enjoyment was something women and young women in particular did on the sly in ways that were sneaky, or using the spaces available within accepted norms in unacceptable ways in order to create space for themselves to find enjoyment, thus not openly challenging restrictions but using spaces within the bounds of accepted social norms to their own advantage. For example, as in many Muslim majority contexts, women in Lyari often use the veil strategically in order to increase their mobility and at times to get away with things that might otherwise be deemed controversial. Women also push the boundaries of cyberspace through a type of virtual veiling. For young women in particular, social media is opening up a platform to explore different sides of their identities and different types of relationships. However, it is still not acceptable for most young women to have Facebook accounts in Lyari. The minority who manage to access social media do so in secret, using a pseudonym and never publicly sharing their own photo on the platform. They can use their accounts to initiate conversations with different people, make friendships, hold discussions, and often flirt. Social media and mobile phones have in fact transformed the ways in which young people communicate, find romantic partners, and have fun in ways that are a constant source of anxiety for members of the older generations. While access to technology is still limited, it is more widespread in middle and lower income urban localities such as Lyari than one might expect, and it is radically transforming social relationships and opening up new possibilities for the experience of enjoyment for young people in general. For instance, one Sunday I went on a picnic with a group made up largely of women students between the ages of 19 and 25 from a vocational training center with which I am affiliated and which provides free or low cost classes in English, IT, beautician training and sewing, mostly to young women in the area. There were about 25 of us on the trip, and we took a coach trip to Thatta, 2 hours outside outside of Karachi to visit several tourist sites. When I arrived at the center in the morning, most of the young women were quite dressed up for the occasion in brightly colored shalwar kameez, dressed in my everyday wear with comfortable sandals and hardly any makeup. I was conscious that I looked quite shabby in comparison. Naila, who helps the center with accounts and is a student at the local university, was wearing very high heels, so high that I wondered how she would walk to all of the sites we planned to visit during the trip and full makeup. Although on normal days most would be wearing a black burqa, very few were wearing them today. Most of the women, however, never took off her niqab throughout the day, and one of the women, however, never took off her niqab throughout the day, and the rest of us kept laughing at her for taking selfies while still wearing it. But she was only exceptional because she took selfies with her niqab on. Otherwise, most of the day seemed all about taking selfies in every possible spot: in the bathroom of the restaurant we stopped at to break our journey, in the bus, and even in and around one of the shrines we visited, which made one of the caretakers scold them, but which hardly stopped them. A few of the young women were also scolded by older male strangers over the course of the day at the shrine and then at a mosque for not dressing properly, which they just shrugged off. After all, these men really did not have any power over them. Let me read it again. After all, these men really did not have any power over them. There was a freedom these young women had when they were away from their own neighborhoods. They truly did not seem to care what people were saying or thinking about them, which was not possible when they were closer to home. They also seemed to relish this freedom. This was most apparent when we went to Hinjar Lake, which was full of families and groups of young men who had come to spend the day playing around in the water, sitting in the tents by the lake, eating, listening to music, and generally enjoying themselves. Here you could see the young women reveling in their freedom. When we piled into a motorboat for a ride around the lake, Arisha, who teaches the beautician course, kept standing up, spreading out her arms and screaming at the top of her lungs with joy, attracting a lot of attention but not really caring about it. When we visited other sports, Arisha would flirt with random guards and police officers in a way that she could never get away within her own neighborhood. On the way back, we were all singing and dancing in our seats and breaking out periodically into fits of laughter. No one seemed to want the day to end. Some of the women kept asking the bus driver to stop at Aladdin Park, an amusement park, on the way home, despite the fact that we were already going to return much later than expected. Over the course of the day, the enjoyment of dressing up and taking selfies was clear. One could argue along the lines of Abu Lugad that this kind of enjoyment reinforced a restrictive and gendered consumer culture that places pressure on women to conform to a particular beauty standard. At the same time, this could also be viewed as an important means of self-expression for these young women in a context where women's sexuality in particular is constantly policed and controlled, and could even be viewed as risky considering the chances of photos being leaked either purposefully or by accident. Secondly, the reason why the young women from the vocational center were able to let loose was because they were away from prying eyes in their own neighborhoods. This gave them the freedom to take off their burqas, dress up, laugh out loud, flirt with strangers, and generally be irrelevant. It provided a break for these women from being constantly under surveillance. While this did not necessarily challenge gender norms within their own context, it was precisely the exceptionality of this event and its geographical distance from their homes that allowed for the possibility of freedom to enjoy. While the young women on the picnic were in some senses challenging gender norms, they were doing so away from the prying eyes of their families and neighbors. These momentary suspensions, though exceptional in some senses, might give these women the confidence to push boundaries when they are back home in their everyday lives. Once they have tasted freedom, they might not be willing to give it up so easily. On another day, I had a conversation with two young women, Sameen and Maham, about what cycling means to them. Sameen is 19 and Maham is 25, and both work for a community organization called the Lyari Girls Cafe, which is a non-governmental organization NGO that offers a variety of free classes to girls and women in the area. The Lyari Girls Cafe started organizing bicycle rides every few Sundays last year, which was a deliberate effort to claim public space for women and girls. This echoed the efforts of another group, Girls on Bikes, which had organized similar rides in Karachi, Lahore and Islamabad. However, while girls on bikes was mostly made up of upper class women cycling in upper class localities in Lyari, the Lyari Girls Cafe catered to women from the lower middle class communities in Lyari. While the act of cycling may not seem particularly controversial, it is rare to see women or girls of any class riding bicycles in Pakistan, whether for transportation, exercise or leisure. Although from conversations with older women, it seems to have been more common in the past. For this reason, riding a bicycle has come to hold a kind of symbolic value when it comes to women asserting their agency and their right to occupy public space. It is also simply a source of enjoyment. When they first started their bike rides, the members of the Lyari Girls Cafe met resistance from the local branch of the Jamaat-e-Islami, a right-wing religion-based political party with a significant amount of support in Lyari. And although they still reportedly face a great deal of harassment, over time they have been able to carve out a space for themselves. More recently, Samin and Maham have started taking their bicycles out together by themselves, which they found both nerve-wracking and exhilarating. While Samin's family did not mind her cycling, she would have to sneak out of her house early in the morning to avoid being seen by her disapproving male cousins. I spoke to the women about why cycling was so important to them. Samin, first of all, we stay fit by cycling, and the second reason is that we have found a solution to the pollution problem through cycling. There is a lot of pollution, and what is important is that we cycle, we feel a sense of freedom, we come very close to freedom, and in the fresh air early in the morning, we really like cycling then and we feel empowered. Maham, and often we hear people say Lyari isn't defense, so we say even if we go to defense, what will be different from Lyari? We say we want Lyari to stay as Lyari, we don't want to make it defense. If girls are cycling on the streets, why are you saying it is like defense, Nida? And girls don't actually cycle on the street in defense, they don't even walk on the street there. Samin, people say this is Naya New Pakistan sarcastically when they see us. Maham, tabdili aa gayi hai, change has come. And someone else said, Baji, you are a girl, you aren't a boy, why are you cycling? I said, Bhai, why are you cycling? This is a sport for girls now. Compared to the picnic, there is a much clearer articulation of resistance in these women's narratives. The young women at the Lyari Girls Cafe were deliberately and consciously challenging gender restrictions through the act of cycling, while many of their justification could be read as attempts at legitimizing their behavior in a socially acceptable manner. For example, the reference to health and the environment, there was also an explicit articulation of a feeling of freedom and empowerment when they cycled, an opportunity to breathe in an otherwise stifling environment, which demonstrated the inextricable link between their pursuit of enjoyment and their assertion of their right to the city. The fact that they were doing this in their own locality under the disapproving gaze of family members and neighbors underlined the boldness of this assertion. At the same time, while they at times cycled in their own neighborhood, they mostly preferred to go to other neighborhoods in Lyari or to an area just outside Lyari where there was a more open space, and they did so early on Sundays when there were relatively few men hanging out on the streets as well. Apart from Samin and Maham, most of the members of the Lyari Girls Cafe who went on these cycling trips were quite young, because restrictions on dress and mobility increased after girls reach puberty and approach what is considered a marriageable age. Hence, in this case as well as in the case of Samin having to sneak out of the house early, there is an aspect of maneuvering around gender restrictions rather than challenging them outright. Like the women at the picnic, Samin and Maham managed to find ways of experiencing fun and enjoyment by strategically navigating within, around and pushing back against the gendered restrictions placed on their mobility. Conclusion: while women and girls find opportunities for fun and enjoyment in multiple spaces, in the gully, on the roof, at a neighbor's house, in the mall, at the market, at a shrine, and in the virtual space of Facebook, WhatsApp, and more recently TikTok, the common thread seemed to be that most often fun and enjoyment happened for women outside their own homes. This is unsurprising given that for the majority of women and girls, the home was the site where they faced the most social restrictions from their male and and older female family members. This goes back to the importance of having fun in public, emphasized by Phatake, Han, and Ranade. For the vast majority of women, the further one traveled from home, the more random one had to challenge gendered codes of behavior. Hence, controlling women's mobility was also key to preserving the gender order. Returning to the original question, were these experiences of fun and enjoyment any more than a momentary break from an otherwise repressive environment? And did these episodes hold within them the possibility of transforming gendered power relations? Well, it is true that women's experiences of enjoyment often took place during exceptional moments or in secret, and despite at times feeding into gendered consumerist desires, these moments can be viewed as providing openings for women to push back against rigid gender codes. Jameson has argued against the moralizing critique made by some within the left of pleasure as a justification for capitalism. Rather, he sees the allegorical potential of pleasure as a means of imagining the systematic revolutionary transformation of society as a whole. While Jameson is speaking in a purely Marxist sense and not referring to gender relations per se, one could also extend his argument to the potential that enjoyment holds for the transformation of the structure of gendered power relations. This points to a lacuna within much feminist theorizing, which has tried to locate women's agency in more explicit forms of protest and activism, and overlooked the transformative potential of everyday activities such as fun and enjoyment. At the same time, in focusing on fun and enjoyment, one should be careful not to slip into romanticizing the lives of poor and lower middle class women, which are fraught with very real restrictions in terms of their mobility from their families, communities, and society in a whole. For example, Saima, who worked at the department store, has since left her job because her fiance and his family would not accept the fact that she was working in such an establishment. Samin has resigned from the Lyari Girls Cafe and has stopped cycling because she said she needed time to focus on her studies, but her colleagues told me that she had likely left due to pressure from her family. The members of the Lyari Girls Cafe were at the time of writing facing a renewed offensive on social media from the local religious parties for tarnishing the image of Lyari and corrupting local women and girls after they had received coverage in the international media through a video made about them by Al Jazeera, and due to their participation in the 2019 Aurat March, which was held on International Women's Day. Hence, even the limited spaces that women claim for themselves in order to experience any kind of joy in their lives are constantly under threat. It is also worth noting that much of what I have described in this paper in terms of how women have fun is not unique to Lyari or Karachi or even Pakistan. One thing that is particular to Lyari, however, is that such opportunities would not have been there during the period of heightened conflict when the mobility of all residents was restricted. This was the case regardless of gender, and my earlier research focuses on the restrictions on mobility faced by young Baloch men during this period. However, for women whose mobility is already restricted, the conflict meant that outings without an explicit purpose just for fun would be much less likely to have occurred. Thus, it is only since 2013, when a paramilitary operation was launched in the city as a whole and violence, at least at the hands of non-state actors such as gangs, subsided, that one can see the resumption of social activities in Lyari and the opening of spaces such as Lyari Girls Cafe. Finally, focusing on fun and arguing for a more complex understanding of marginalized urban spaces does not mean ignoring the issue of violence. As Pavani and Tulumelo argue, there is no such thing as a violence-free urban space, and the imagination of such a space in security discourses tends to produce new kinds of violence. Rather, like fun, violence is always a part of everyday life, whether it is the memory of past violence or the imminent threat of future violence, and whether it is physical, structural, or symbolic in form. And as Verkaik argues, at times violence is even experienced as a form of fun. In an economically deprived area such as Lyari, which has experienced almost 2 decades of violence at the hands of multiple actors, and in the lives of women who constantly face the threat of violence in their daily lives, so one cannot forget the fact that violence exists. However, focusing focusing exclusively on violence gives an incomplete picture, including an analysis of other aspects of social life, such as experiences of fun and enjoyment, provides a more complex picture of the richness that constitutes everyday urban life and highlights the multiple ways in which women creatively negotiate within, around, and against various spatial and social boundaries, agentative, thus allowing space for the agentive possibilities of player to emerge. Acknowledgements. I would like to thank the women whose stories inspired this paper. My friends at the Lyari Girls Cafe and the Sindh Tech Skills Development Center, who's opened their spaces and hearts to me and facilitated the field work for this research. I would also like to thank the South Asia program at Cornell University and the Saida Waheed Gender Initiative at the Lahore University of Management Sciences for allowing me to present and receive feedback on earlier drafts of this paper. Finally, I am extremely grateful to the editors of this special section, Ulka Anjaria and Jonathan Shapiro Anjaria, and the 3 anonymous South Asia reviewers for their valuable and insightful feedback, which helped me to further clarify my thinking and hone my arguments. Disclosure: no potential conflict of interest was reported by the authors. So that was all. I hope you liked the article, and I would again request the listeners to have at least ample amount of time, or when you are about to sleep, so just play this video and listen, because it has, like, I would like to say that it has the experiences of the women. This article showcases, which are actually most of the time overshadowed, and I found it really good. So that's why I wanted to do the voiceover of this article. So thank you everyone, and thank you Nida Kirmani for your permission for doing the voiceover of this article. Thank you everyone. Take care, and take very good care of yourself and your family. Take care. Bye bye.